We are continuing along our discussion of the virtues of Eretz Yisrael. And today we are on page 179. Page 179. And we're on the bottom paragraph, starting with the words Rabbi Chanina, paragraph number 6. So these are just more examples of how the sages extol the virtue of Eretz Yisrael. Here's a story. It says Rabbi Chanina objected when he was asked if it was permissible for a certain individual to leave Eretz Yisrael in order to perform levirate marriage. We all know what yibum or levirate marriage is. It's a practice that we don't do anymore, but we do chalitza instead. But the practice is that if a man dies and he leaves over a widow without children, there is a mitzvah for the decedent's brother to marry the widow in order to be able to build a home for his deceased brother. And so the surviving brother was living in Israel, and the woman, the widow, was living in Chutz La'aretz. She must have been in Bavel or some other place. And so he had a shaila, should he travel to Chutz La'aretz in order to do the mitzvah of Yibum? And Rabbi Chanina said, his brother married a heathen and died. Blessed be the omnipresent for killing him. You now wish for his brother to follow him? And what Rabbi Chanina was contemptuous of a woman who had persuaded her husband to live in Chutz La'aretz. So he called her, what does he call her? He called her a goya. What we would call today, we would also use a derogatory, which I don't like the derogatory term, but I'll say it anyway, a shiksa. Right? He married a shiksa, so you're going to make him. The reason I don't like it is because it's not nice to call any human being a disgusting creature. But in any event, the point is that he marries this woman. She was 100% Jewish. She was as Jewish as you and I, but he called her a goya to make a point. She behaved like a heathen by persuading her husband to leave Eretz Yisrael. So God killed him as a result because he acquiesced to his wife. And now you want to go and you want to repeat your brother's mistake. So that's another example of the emphasis that was placed on Eretz Yisrael. Another example, page 180. The rabbis forbade the selling of real estate, both land and houses in Eretz Yisrael, to non-Jews. Nor may the land of Israel be left in a state of barrenness. Now this paragraph is very loaded, especially during a Shemitah year. Is everyone familiar with this concept called the heter mechira? Heter mechira is what was originally established in the early part of the 20th century when there was the Shivat Zion movement, when a lot of Jews, even before the establishment of the state, were starting to come back to Eretz Yisrael from Europe. And also to a lesser degree from Africa. So there was a big dilemma. There was no developed agricultural system in Israel in the early part of the 20th century. How were Jews who were barely growing sufficient, basic staples of produce going to survive during the Shemitah year if they couldn't plant and they couldn't work the soil? So the rabbinate at the time in the early 20th century, including Rav Kook himself, who was the chief rabbi of Israel, came out with a ruling that it was permitted to do what we do before Pesach. Before Pesach, we sell our chametz to a goy, and we still keep the chametz in our cupboards and in our homes, but it doesn't belong to us because we've written a contract saying that it belongs to a non-Jew. So the rabbinate had said, in the early part of the 20th century, that you can do the same. I think it might have been even already at the end of the 19th century. I don't remember the historicity anymore. But they came along and they said that you can do the same with the land of Eretz Yisrael. You can sell your acreage, your farm, sell it to a non-Jew, sell it to an Arab. And the laws of Shemitah, according to some opinions, do not apply to Gentile-owned land. and so therefore the land no longer has kedusha. It no longer has the sanctity. The laws of Shemitah no longer apply to it, and therefore it is permitted for it to work the soil. This heter was given at a time when the stakes were survival, which meaning that if people did not work the soil, they would either die of starvation or they'd have to leave Eretz Yisrael. And it was on that basis that the heter was initially given. Now, today it's much more difficult to rely on the heter mechira because there are other options. But one of the difficulties, one of the leniencies that the heter mechira relies upon is that it is permitted in the first place to either abandon your soil and consign it to someone else, and even worse, to sell it to a non-Jew. So you know that the rabbis say you're not allowed to sell real estate to a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael. So what you're doing is in order to obviate a much larger prohibition of Shemitah, you're selling your farm to a Gentile, which may only be a rabbinic prohibition. It's not clear whether it's rabbinic or biblical in nature, but it's not clear. There's a whole discussion about how this is permitted despite the fact that it is now you've sold it. So some want to argue that since you're still occupying the land, but the title on the land is now non-Jews instead of a Jews, you're not really in violation of selling it to a non-Jew because it's still occupied by a Jew. But it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to rely upon. And we had a guest lecturer here who said that it's okay to rely on the heter mechira. I vehemently disagree with him in a very respectful fashion. I think today, especially if you're a tourist, you should not rely on the heter mechira. I don't understand why people feel at such liberty to do so. I mean, we're dealing with something that potentially is, it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck. And so we come from Chutz La'aretz. We want to go to Eretz Yisrael. We want to enjoy the land. We want to benefit from all of the spiritual benefits. Why then are we compromising on some of the spiritual dangers of going to Eretz Yisrael? Doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me that we should be able to rely on this. It's one thing to tell a farmer to rely on the heter mechira because this is his parnasa. He needs a family to feed. But especially we in Chutz La'aretz, we should not rely on the heter mechira when we go to Israel. And there are plenty of other solutions in the 21st century to work around the problem of Kedushat Shavi'it. There are plenty of solutions that are being employed by millions of people in Israel. So just something that for you to keep in mind. This is one of the problems with the heter mechira, which is selling land to non-Jews. Yes?
So does that mean that religious real estate agents in Israel will not sell property to non-Jews?
It sounds like that to me. I don't know how this is put into practice if you're a realtor. I would imagine that there's not that much demand. You know, the Vatican is the biggest landowner in the land of Israel today. I don't know if people are aware of that. The Greek Orthodox Church and the Vatican, but the Vatican is the biggest owner of real estate in Israel today. There are huge, huge plots of land owned by the Vatican. I don't know how that happened. I'm sure that predated the founding of the state. But it's not such a big market for non-Jews to purchase real estate. I don't know how it works on a practical basis today. What?
It's too expensive.
Well, that doesn't stop investors in Torornto. Yeah. Okay. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Paragraph number 8. They also stated that a Jewish court outside Eretz Yisrael may not preside over civil cases involving monetary penalties. This is another not well-known law, but today a Beit Din does not impose that which we call a kenas, a penalty. If a person goes to Beit Din, there are certain times when the Torah imposes a kenas, a penalty above and beyond the monetary loss of the aggrieved party. So, for example, the Torah says that if I steal from you, and I'm caught with the stolen goods, not only do I have to return the stolen goods to you, but I also have to pay a penalty of the value of what I've stolen. So if I steal a $100 Kiddush cup from you, I have to return your Kiddush cup plus write you a check for $100. Well, that is not put into practice in religious courts. If you were to take me to a Beis Din to get your Kiddush cup back, the Beis Din would only be able to force me to relinquish the Kiddush cup. They couldn't force me to pay the kenas, because only a Beit Din in Eretz Yisrael can preside over civil cases involving monetary penalties. And there's a general understanding among the sages that the authority, and that's, by the way, the idea of, when you look at the Talmud, you notice that some rabbis have the title of Rabbi, and some rabbis have the title of Rav. What's the difference between Rabbi with a Yud and Rav? After a certain period of time, when there was a schism and a split between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, Rabbi were the rabbis who had gotten smicha in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore were permitted to preside over these kinds of civil cases. And Rav was a person who was not ordained in the chain of tradition from Eretz Yisrael, and therefore he was a Talmid Chacham. Sometimes he was even greater in his wisdom and his knowledge than his Israeli counterpart, but he did not have the line of tradition that imbued within him, that vested within him the rights to preside over certain cases. And there are many, and also a slave of a Jew may not be sold to a party outside of Eretz Yisrael. And there are many more such citations. Let's go on to the next paragraph, paragraph number 9. Our sages further said that the air of Eretz Yisrael makes one wise. And I want to address that in our handout today. The Avirah de Eretz Yisrael machkim, the air of Eretz Yisrael makes one wise. Now there are two ways of understanding that. You can understand that in the normative way, or in the rational way, or the metaphysical way. You can understand that as, like the Balei HaTosafot understands it, is that going to Eretz Yisrael makes you wise. Why? Because as soon as you come to Eretz Yisrael, first of all, you're becoming wise automatically. You have to practice your Hebrew, right? So you have to read all of the street signs and all of the shop signs, and you have to say to the Makolikai Kama Ze Ole, right? And all of these other things. So you immediately become wiser because you're practicing Hebrew. But more than that is that you go to the temple and you are surrounded by a spiritual environment which is very much unlike the environment that you come from in the diaspora. And so it's that, on a rational level, it's that complete infusion of a Torah way of life that permeates everything in Eretz Yisrael, not just the religious, but even the non-religious as well. The phrases that people use, the television, you turn on the television in Eretz Yisrael, for goodness sake, they're having a conversation about Parshat HaShavua, right? So, there's so much in Eretz Yisrael today that where the wisdom of the Torah permeates the entire culture, and that's true to this day. That's my point. But there's a metaphysical explanation as well, that some rabbis understand this statement to mean that no, there's a metaphysical avirah that we cannot quantify and we cannot identify on a normative level. That really just imbues your neshama, like you feel like you're home, and you can't quantify it, but there's something that elevates you both spiritually and intellectually because of it. Out of their love for Eretz Yisrael, they said, anyone who walks 4 cubits, Arba Amot, in Eretz Yisrael, will surely merit the world to come. And once Rabbi Zera, who so yearned to reside in Eretz Yisrael, eagerly began to cross the river that led into Eretz Yisrael. This was probably the Jordan River, despite the fact that he had no easy means of crossing. When ridiculed by a heretic, he responded, if the likes of Moshe and Aharon did not merit to dwell there, who is to say that I shall merit? So here he is at the banks of the Jordan River, jumps in the water, and starts wading his way across. Who knows if he's going to make it? So the guy says, what, are you crazy? Just wait a minute, we'll build a raft. Find another narrower passage to cross. He says, no, I got to go right away. I mean, what an opportunity. I finally made it to the border of Eretz Yisrael. Nothing's going to stop me at this point. And he rushes forward. So this is where we're going to hold our text for today. in the Kuzari. I wanted to spend a few minutes with you on discussing this very famous quote of Avira de Eretz Yisrael machkim. The air of the land of Israel makes one wise. There are two little snippets from Rabbeinu Bechaya that I wanted to share with you, and something from Rabbeinu Bechaya, of course, is a medievalist, lives in the, I believe, the 14th century. And then I want to discuss with you that something that Rav Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg had said in the Sridei Eish, and discuss that with you for just a few minutes. So let's take a look. One is where Rabbeinu Bechaya is discussing the mitzvah to construct the menorah in the Mishkan. Now, the menorah in the Mishkan, the Torah says, is supposed to be in the Darom, supposed to be on the south side. And what does the menorah represent? You know, there's the menorah and the shulchan. The menorah, when you walk into the holy part, the covered part of the Mishkan, you're facing westward. So if you look to your left, that's the southern part, and if you look to your right, that's the northern part. In the northern part of the Heichal, you had the showbread table. So just imagine in your mind's eye, you're walking into the Heichal. You've got the golden altar right over here as first when you walk in, right on your right side. And then you walk straight down, and on your left side you see the menorah, and on the right side you see the showbread table. The showbread table represents physical sustenance. The menorah, which is light, represents intellectual sustenance. And so that's why the sages tell us, Harotzeh she ya'ashir yatzpin, harotzeh she yachkim yadrim. That if a person wishes to become wealthy, he should face north during his prayers, facing north as reminiscent of the showbread table, sustenance, physical sustenance, wealth. Harotzeh sheyadrim, harotzeh sheyachkim yadrim. But if he wants to become wise, he should face a southerly direction during his prayers, because you think of the south and you associate that with wisdom, with the menorah, with the light of the menorah. So comes along Rabbeinu Bechaya and he says as follows. V'haita munachat b'darom mipnei sherov ha'chochma b'darom. He says the reason why the menorah, what's that?
We don't do either, so we're dumb and poor.
We face Eretz Yisrael, which is eastward, right? That's a good question. Why don't we do it? Why don't we do it today? Because that's, right, so the Gemara, it seems like the later poskim said you can think about the north or think about the south. Some actually say that while you're facing east, you can turn your head to the right. Let's see, if I'm facing east and I'm turning my head to the right, I'm facing south. And if I'm facing to the left, I'm facing... So there's different opinions as to how to mitigate this based on the fact that we face Eretz Yisrael during our prayers. Okay, so V'haita munachat b'darom b'nei sherov ha'chochma b'darom. So he says, why is the menorah in the south? Because wisdom lies in the south. This does not bode well for Canadians. V'nikreit Eretz Yisrael Eretz hadarom. So he says, why is Eretz Yisrael called the land of the south, or the southern land? Lefi shehi munachat b'mivchar ha'mikamot. Because it is found in the choicest of places. It's the choicest piece of real estate in the world. Be'emtza ha'aklim, mishiv'a aklimim sheha'olam nechelak bahem. It is in the most temperate aklim, which is sometimes, how would you translate aklim? Climate? Climate. But it's also referring to a latitudinal divide in the northern hemisphere, which is what he's referring to. It is the most temperate. It's the middle in the latitudinal sectors in the northern hemisphere. V'hi mizuga yoter mikor v'chom. It is the most temperate of climates from both cold and heat. Umuchenet lekabel hamuskalot, and it is therefore the most propitious for intellect, for the developments of one's intellect. Because in the medieval world, climate directly affects the way that you think. I don't think it's just a medieval concept. I think it's true, I think culture is in many ways defined by climate. It's no coincidence that people in Southern California are very laid back. and just very like, hey, it's whatever, dude. It's like whatever works for you works for me, because everything's okay. Because you know why everything's okay? Because every day you walk outside and everything's great, right? And people get more uptight in harsher climates, right? So if you want to have a temperate way of thinking, you live in a temperate climate. So v'zehu shadarshu razal, and that's why our sages tell us uzahav haaretz hahitov, that referring to the Garden of Eden, it says the gold of that land is good, and it's really a reference to one of the borders of the Garden of Eden, which is a reference to Eretz Yisrael. And the rabbi said about that pasuk that ein Torah ki Torat Eretz Yisrael, ve'ein chochma ki chochmat Eretz Yisrael. There is no Torah like the Torah of Israel. There is no wisdom like the wisdom of Israel. V'od darshu avirat Eretz Yisrael machkim. And they also said that the air of Eretz Yisrael makes one wise. Okay, so that's one thing in relation to the menorah. Another point that Rabbeinu Bechaya makes much, much later in his commentary in Parshas Ekev, where the Torah describes Eretz Yisrael as Eretz Asher Lo V'miskenut Tochal Lechem. It is a place that not out of poverty, or how would you translate miskenut? Miskein is a poor person, a pitiful person, right? A poor, unfortunate person is a miskein, right? So, lo b'miskenut tochalechem. You're not going to eat bread in a pitiful state. Lo techsar kolba. You will lack for nothing in Eretz Yisrael. That's the way the Torah describes the land. So comes along Rabbeinu Bechai and he says, Haaretz shehi mile'ah kol tuv kigan Hashem ke'eretz Mitzrayim. It is a land that is filled with all goodness, like the garden of God, like Egypt. V'hi chasera mimiksat hadivarim hanimtzeim b'makomot zulatam. He says it does, however, lack certain small items. In other words, if you have a land that is filled with everything good, there also are still certain deficiencies in that place that you won't be able to find in that land, but you'll be find somewhere else. So therefore, the people who live there, even if they live in a very, very lush bread basket, will nevertheless eat their bread in a state of pitifulness, because and that's why even in contrast to places like Egypt, Eretz Yisrael is extolled because there's nothing lacking at all. There is not one single piece of produce that you cannot find in Eretz Yisrael, but you can find somewhere else. Eretz Yisrael, says Rabbeinu Bechai, because of its moderate climate, is capable of producing every single species of produce. And we're actually witness to that today in the 21st century. You can grow anything in Eretz Yisrael. It's remarkable. You want to grow bananas, they grow bananas. You want to grow apples, they grow apples. You want to grow watermelons.
They don't have blueberries.
They don't have blueberries?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. In the Golan, they do. It's hard to get them.
Yes, they have blueberries.
They have blueberries. Good to know.
Well, there you go. Rabbeinu Bechaya has been vindicated by the blueberries. Okay, all right.
We're going to go look at it.
All right, end of round one. Go back to your corners. Okay. Right. Ding, ding, ding. Okay. There are certain kinds of produce that you can only find in Israel and you can't find anywhere else. That's what the Torah means it says you'll lack for nothing. But then he says something else. He says put aside the physical bounty of Eretz Yisrael. He says when we say that it is without pitifulness that you will be able to eat bread in Eretz Yisrael, the Torah is speaking metaphorically on an intellectual level when it comes to wisdom and the acquisition of Torah. Because after all, we know that Torah is compared metaphorically to bread, as it says in Proverbs, go out and fight for my bread, which is a way of talking about study Torah. ולפי שהתורה והחוכמה אי אפשר לאדם להשיגם על השלמות, אלא עם ההכנות הראויות הצריכות לו. We know that Torah and wisdom cannot be acquired in their entirety unless a person has properly primed and prepared himself or herself. ומלבד ההכנות, יצטרך שיהיה אוויר הארץ זך וטוב, כי יועיל הרבה בלימוד. He says, not only does a person have to internally be prepared and primed for the intellectual exercise of Torah study, but a person also has to be in an environment where the air is crisp and fresh and will help him study. You know, I've always said the only criticism that I have of the architecture of this building is that we don't have enough windows in this place. There just aren't enough windows. And I'm fighting. One of my campaigns is in the Turk-based medrash. You can cut out windows very, very nicely along the sides. We just, people need to know that in order to study successfully, you need to be in a proper environment. There's even a halacha that when you daven, there's supposed to be windows in the room where you daven. And I mean, obviously you can still daven if there aren't windows, but optimally there should be. The environment which you're in clearly does affect how you internalize information and how you process information. If you're in a very austere conditions, sometimes it's more difficult. Anyway, so he says, "V'tuv ha'achanot ve'ha'avir hatov asher ba'aretz." He says, the best place for preparing oneself or priming oneself and the best air is in Eretz Yisrael. Al ken yomar ha'chachamim sheba lo yochlu b'miskinut lachma shel Torah. And that's what the Torah means. He says, there will be no pitifulness in the way that you consume Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Ki hiye libam kepitcho shel ulam letuv ha'achanot v'rechava min hayam letuv ha'avir. He says, because when you live in Eretz Yisrael, your heart will be opened wide, your mind will be expanded vastly because of the good air and the other qualities of Eretz Yisrael. He goes back to that same idea that he mentioned before. Okay, so therefore, that's another place where Rabbeinu Bachaya makes reference to this idea. And finally, I wanted to point out the Rabbi Chil Yaakov Weinberg was writing a halachic responsum having to do with the laws of estates and inheritance. And at the end, the last two paragraphs, he just switches gears completely. And he writes the last two paragraphs as follows. He says, V'hinei bat Torah ne'amar, this is the bottom paragraph. This is a rabbi who lived in the 20th century. He lived through the war, started in Europe, survived the war, and then made his way to Switzerland. Never made Aliyah. One of the ironies of Rabbi Chil Yaakov Weinberg is that he wrote in a personal correspondence, he says, I would love to be in Eretz Yisrael today, but Eretz Yisrael is religiously polarized. He says you've got the Dati Le'umi, you've got the religious Zionist world, and you've got the Haredi world. He says, I don't know where I would fit. He says, I've got a foot in both worlds, and I would be, he was such a guddle that everyone respected him. He said there would be a tug of war of where I wouldn't know where to park myself. And therefore it's too difficult. There's such a stark breach between those two camps that I don't know where to put myself, and therefore he just decided to avoid the problem entirely. And at his funeral, as a matter of fact, there was a lot of fighting going on as to who would handle the levaya, who would bear the casket. There were people from the religious Zionist world who wanted to participate, people from the Haredi world. I mean, so you see, like, he was a very conflicted person. But when he talks about Eretz Yisrael, he says as follows. He says, V'hinei b'Torah ne'emar ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh. He says, in the Torah it says that man is like a tree of the field. That human beings can be compared to trees. Ha'adam domeh la'etz kemo be'etz yesh shnei gormim legidulo uleprichato. He says, human beings are like trees. In what way? Well, trees are dependent upon two things in order to grow properly. Hakarka shuhu mushrash bo, v'ha'avir shuhu chai bo, v'sho'ef mimenu. He says you need good soil because the roots of the tree are embedded in the soil. And you also need good air because the tree draws a lot of sustenance from the environment. Kain ha'adam tzarich ligidulo haruchani lekarka shuhu nolad v'hishtaresh bo. A human being is no different. You need good soil, which is the place where you're born. In other words, where do your roots come from? Wherever your Eretz Moledet is, the land of your birth is. Okay? Ula avir hasviva sha'otohu noshim b'kirbo. U'mimenu hu chai u'mitpateach. And then you have to determine, where am I currently living at a time when I'm trying to develop into a proper person. The environment which I find myself in also is a contributing factor. So it's almost like nature versus nurture. Where do I come from? My roots, the land where I was born. That's definitely going to affect the person that I am, but also where I am developing right now currently also has a profound effect. And he says, Be'eretz Yisrael haya lanu shnei hadivarim. The land of Israel provided us with both the proper soil and the proper air. Admat kodesh, admat avotenu Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov. So he says the soil itself is a holy soil. It's the soil of our ancestors, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's one of the most inspiring things. Like, you can go walk on a hill, and you know that you're walking on the same soil that your ancestors walked on and the Nevi'im walked on. It's like amazing. Admat ha-Nevi'im v'ha-Tanaim ha-Kedoshim. It's the soil of the prophets. It's the soil of the rabbis who wrote the Mishnah. All holy people. V'ha-Avir ha-Kadosh el ha-Aretz ha-Kedosha. But the air of Eretz Yisrael, which is not the same air, it's new air, but that's also holy. Avira d'Eretz Yisrael machkim, omrim Chazal, v'anachnu shenoladnu begalut. So we who are born in the diaspora, be'eretz nochriya v'gam ha'avir hu nochri. So we have two disadvantages. We were born in a foreign land, and we are breathing foreign air. Hasviva hi nochrit, so our environment is foreign. Ein lanu efsharut l'chiot u'lehitkayem ki Yehudim ela al yedei kach. So how can we live as Jews if our roots are not from a Jewish source? Our air is not Jewish air. So how can we live like Jews? The only way to do it is sha'asinu lanu batei knesset u'batei midrash v'yeshivot, because we built in our Jewish communities in the diaspora synagogues, study halls, and yeshivas, schools. Shevahem ha'avir nitkadesh b'kedushat ha'Torah. In those structures, the air is sanctified through our artificial transplanting of the air of Eretz Yisrael to make this holy air through our Torah conversations and our prayers. So when we sit in the synagogues and the study halls and we study Torah and we pray, we breathe within our being the spirit of Torah, and it is in that merit that we are able to survive as Jews. Despite the fact that we are still living in a foreign land. But for a Jew, it is better for him to make aliyah, to live in Eretz Yisrael. Sham hakol kodesh v'hakol Yehudi. There, everything is holy, not just inside the shul, and everything is Jewish, not just inside the synagogue. Haaretz v'ha'avir, both the land and the air. Hasviva v'habayit v'hashuk, the surroundings, the house, the marketplace, everywhere you turn, it's holy. Go to Machane Yehuda, it's holy. You go to downtown Tel Aviv, it's holy. It may not feel holy at the moment, right? But it's holy nonetheless. Right? There are those who have argued. You have to know how far to take this argument. So therefore, I don't need to be religious if I'm living in Eretz Yisrael, right? Because I'm surrounded by Kedusha. So that's, of course, a distortion of this argument. Every person still has the personal responsibility for Torah observance, but we still have to realize that just by virtue of a Jew living in Eretz Yisrael, and he or she is surrounded by that holy air and that holy soil, that places them at a distinct advantage. Can I tell you that a Jew living in Eretz Yisrael who's not fully observant is inferior to a Jew who's fully observant in Chutz La'aretz? I cannot tell you that. And I would defy anyone who can say with authority one way or the other. That's Hashem's business. But what I can tell you is what Rabbeinu Bechaya tells us. He says it's always better for a Jew to be in Eretz Yisrael because you're immersed in an environment which is intrinsically holy. Okay, so, yes,
I would like to mention something about אווירה בארץ ישראל מחכימה.
בבקשה.
That even some storekeepers, when you go in, they teach you also Torah or something. Because it happened to me in Yerushalayim, in the area of Geula. I went into a store by the name of Aryeh. Aryeh store. The name is Aryeh. So I went in and I mentioned about Aryeh Yish'ag mi lo yira.
Which is a pasuk, which means that if when a lion roars, who will not fear?
Nachon. So he told me that Aryeh stands really Rashi Tevot. Aleph is Elul, and Resh is Rosh Hashanah, and Yud is Yom Kippur, and He is Hoshana Rabbah.
There you
So
go.
it stands for all that.
It stands for that period of awe, of days of awe.
The
Yeah.
storekeeper, that he owns the store Aryeh.
And he may not have even been wearing a kippah. You know, the taxi drivers,
Also the taxi drivers.
the cab drivers. You take a cab. I took a cab Motzei Shabbat a couple of years ago. The guy was not wearing a kippah, but he's listening to the radio, the Motzei Shabbos radio program of Rav Avaji Yoseph of blessed memory. And so you see, it's like you're surrounded by it, right? And so you can't judge people by the way they look or the way they speak. The idioms of Eretz Yisrael. How do you say, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China? That's our idiom of saying that you're talking about two things that have nothing to do with each other.
Ma inyan shmita etzel har
Ma inyan shmita etzel har Sinai. Right. So you've cited a medrash just by saying, and Israelis have no idea that they're reciting a medrash. Right. Ma inyan shmita etzel har Sinai says, why does the Torah juxtapose the laws of Shemitah and talking about Moshe speaking to the Jews at Har Sinai? So if you were to ask the typical Israeli, would you break down that, and were you aware that this was a Rashi at the beginning of Parshas Bahar? They'd look at you with like deer in the headlights look. What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. But the point is that you're immersed. You're totally immersed. Okay. Adkan.